To start, when we talk about economics, just think about an item being produced. Let's say toothpaste. Someone buying the item, that's the consumer, and the exchange of money that occurs. That's all economics is. The relationship between producer, consumer, and the exchange of money. It doesn't matter if it's something as simple as toothpaste or something as complicated as computers. Now, to begin this podcast, we need to understand that governments establish the type of economy found in a country. This is important because not all economies are the same, and because of that, not everyone has the same economic rights and privileges. For example, we have the economic right to start our own business, or we have the economic freedom to choose our own profession. Not everyone has the same economic rights and freedoms that we do. So governments establish the type of economy found in a country. And there are four types of economies. They are traditional, market, command, and mixed. And we'll look at these more closely. Traditional economy. A traditional economy can be defined as an underdeveloped economy in which communities use primitive tools and methods to harvest and hunt for food. In a traditional economy, much of the farming is called subsistence farming, or growing enough food to feed their families. In a traditional economy, it's not about making money, it's about survival. You typically find traditional economies in countries with weak or corrupt governments, and because of that, many people living in a traditional economy will never experience a life where you work to make money so you can buy things. To move away from a traditional economy, a government would need to help farmers by providing them with money for irrigation or even a tractor. In doing so, fewer people would be needed to farm, allowing some to get an education or learn a new skill. But because of weak and corrupt governments, this economic growth will never be achieved. Market economy. A market economy can be defined as an economic system based on free trade and competition, with little to no government involvement. Let's take our friend Bill as an example. Now, Bill has a great idea. He wants to start his own business and sell fake piles of dog poo. Bill gets to set his own price. He also gets to decide how many fake piles of dog poop he wants to produce. And he also gets to decide who he wants to trade with. In a market economy, Bill's company will either make or lose money, and it's all driven by the idea of supply and demand. To help us better understand supply and demand, let's use Apple's iPod Touch as an example. The iPod Touch first generation was released in September 2007. It had a price tag of $249.99 for 8 gigs, and because Apple wasn't sure if it would be a success, they produced 250,000 units right off the bat. Turns out the iPod Touch was a huge success. Stores couldn't keep them on the shelves. The demand exceeded the supply, which in Apple's case is a good problem to have. So, they release the iPod Touch second generation, 1 year later, in September of 2008. This time, knowing that consumers will pay $250, they decide to raise the price to $299.99. And because they knew that they didn't have enough supply to meet the demand last time, they produced 600,000 units right off the bat. The iPod Touch second generation was also a success. Now they have a fourth generation iPod Touch, and Apple is a great example of supply and demand. If consumers did not like the first generation iPod Touch, Apple probably would not have released a second generation. They would not have raised the price. And they certainly would not have made 600,000 more units. So the consumer in a market economy will dictate the price of an item. How much are you willing to spend on an iPod Touch. And also, how many a company should produce. Supply should equal demand. Moving on, let's look at a command economy. A command economy can be defined as an economic system in which the central government makes all the economic decisions. Let's take our friend Bill as an example again. He still has the bright idea of starting a business where he makes fake piles of dog poop. In a command economy, the government would say, no, we don't need a business that makes fake piles of dog poop. If you want to start your own business, then you can make wooden shoes. The government also tells Bill how much he has to charge, as well as how many units to produce, and who he can trade with. In some cases, the government can even go as far as to tell Bill that maybe they don't think he's qualified to start his own business. That's a command economy. The last type of economy we'll look at today is called a mixed economy. A mixed economy can be defined as an economic system that promotes private business ownership but contains some government involvement or regulations. The name mixed economy says it all. It's a combination of a market and command economy. Most nations, including the United States, have a mixed economy. But because the U.S. economy is still dominated by private business, we often label ourselves a market economy. Many people in the United States disapprove of government involvement in our economy. But in some cases, it's a good thing. For example, what would happen if all the major gas providers in the United States combined to form a monopoly? Well, because there would be no competition, gas stations could charge whatever they wanted for a gallon of gas. It's because of competition that prices stay as low as possible. Thankfully, our government prevents monopolies from taking place. So this is an example of how government involvement can have a positive impact on our economy. A real-life example would be the case of telecommunications company AT&T. 30 years ago, AT&T was close to having a monopoly in the telecommunications industry. This would have allowed them to charge whatever they wanted for phone service and long-distance calling. The government stepped in and broke AT&T up into 7 different companies. You might be familiar with one of them. It's Verizon. Government influences. Now that we're familiar with the 4 different types of economies, let's look at other ways the government impacts our economy. One way is by placing embargoes on countries that prevent trade. Because of our bad relationship with Cuba, and because they are a communist country, it is illegal to buy and sell goods with Cuba. It's even illegal to travel there. This embargo has been in place for nearly 50 years. Another way the government impacts our economy is through taxes. We discussed earlier that economics is the relationship between producer and consumer. In order to be a consumer, you need to have money to spend. But did you know that 25% of the money you make goes towards local, state, and federal taxes? So in the future, if you make $45,000 a year and the government receives 25% of your earnings, that's over $11,000 that you don't get to see or spend. The good news is that that money is used to keep roads safe, it allows your grandparents to retire, and it keeps public schools operating so you can receive an education. Lastly, the government impacts our economy by making budget cuts depending on national and state deficits. A deficit is when a government is spending more money than it is earning. When this happens, cuts are made in spending and people can lose jobs. Our current national debt is $14.5 trillion. To pay that off, every man, woman, and child living in the United States would need to write a check to the American government for $50,000.